many foods and beverages that contain body or mind-altering substances, coffee was originally used, on scale at least, by people of faith, leveraging it as an aid for religious rituals. Sufis in what is today Yemen, back in the early 15th century, consumed it as a stimulant, which allowed them to more thoroughly commit themselves to their worship, and it was being used by the Muslim faithful in Mecca around the same time. By the following century, it spread to the Levant, and from there it was funneled into larger trade routes and adopted by civilizations throughout the Mediterranean world, including the Ottomans, the Mamluks, groups in Italy and northern Africa, and a few hundred years later, all the way over to India and the East Indies. Western Europeans got their hands on this beverage by the late 1600s, and it really took off in Germany and Holland, where coffee houses, which replicated an establishment type that was popularized across the Muslim world the previous century, started to pop up all over the place. Folks would visit these hubs in lieu of ale houses, subbing in stimulants for depressants, and they were spaces in which it was appropriate for people across the social and economic strata to interact with each other, playing board games like chess and backgammon, and cross-pollinating their knowledge and beliefs. According to some scholars, this is part of why coffee houses were banned in many countries, including England, where they also became popular, because those up top, including but not limited to royalty, considered them to be hotbeds of reformatory thought, political instability, and potentially even revolution. Let the people hang out with each other and allow them to discuss whatever they like, and you end up with a bunch of potential enemies and potential threats to existing power structures. It's also been claimed, and this of course would be difficult to definitively prove, though the timing does seem to line up, that the introduction of coffee to Europe is part of what led to the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. The theory being that swapping out alcohol, at least during the day, and creating these spaces in which ideas and understandings and experiences could be swapped without as much concern about social status as in other popular third places, spots beyond home and work that allowed all sorts of political ideas to flourish, it helped inventions become realized, in part because there were coffee houses that catered to investors, one of which eventually became the London Stock Exchange, but also because it helped people organize, and do so in a context in which they were hyper alert and aware, and they were more likely to engage in serious conversation, which is a stark contrast to the sorts of conversations you might have when half or fully drunk at an alehouse, exclusively amongst a bunch of your social and economic peers. If it did play a role in these movements, coffee was almost certainly just one ingredient in a larger recipe. Lots of variables were swirling around in these areas that seem to have contributed to those cultural and technological and economic and governmental shifts. The impact of such beverages on the human body and mind, and human society aside though, coffee has become globally popular and thus economically vital. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. Coffee's role in the global economy, and recent numbers that show coffee prices are ballooning, and they're expected to balloon still further, perhaps substantially, in the coming years. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. For a long while, coffee was a bit of a novelty outside of the Muslim world, even in European locales that had decently well-established coffee houses. That changed when the Dutch East India Company started importing the beans to the Netherlands in the early 17th century. By the mid-1600s, they were bringing in commercial-scale shipments to Amsterdam, which led to the expansion of the beverages trade range throughout Europe. The Dutch then started cultivating their own coffee crops in colonial territories, including Ceylon, which today is called Sri Lanka, and the island of Java. The British East India Company took a similar approach around the same time, and that eventually led to coffee bean cultivation in North America, though it did not do terribly well there initially, as tea and alcoholic beverages were more popular with the locals. In the late 18th century, though, North Americans were boycotting British tea, and that led to an uptick in coffee consumption thereabouts, though this paralleled a resurgence in tea drinking back in Britain, in part because they weren't shipping as much tea to their North American colonies, and in part because they conquered India, and were thus able to import a whole lot more tea from the thriving Indian tea industry. The Americas became more important to the burgeoning global coffee trade in the mid-1700s after a French naval officer brought a coffee plant to Martinique in the Caribbean, and that plant flourished, serving as the source of almost all of today's arabica coffee beans, as it was soon spread to what is today Haiti, and by 1788, Haiti's coffee plantations provided about half of the world's coffee. It's worth remembering that this whole industry, the portion of it run by the Europeans at least, was built on the back of slaves. These Caribbean plantations in particular were famously abusive, and that abuse eventually resulted in the Haitian Revolution of 1791, which 5 years later led to the territory's independence. That said, coffee plantations elsewhere, like in Brazil and across other parts of South and Central America, continued to flourish throughout this period, colonialists basically popping into an area, conquering it, and enslaving the locals, putting them to work on whatever kind of plantation made the most sense for the local climate. Many of these conquered areas and their enslaved locals were eventually able to free themselves, though in some cases it took a long time, about a century in Brazil's case. Some plantations ended up being maintained even after the locals gained their freedom from their European conquerors, though. Brazil's coffee industry, for instance, began with some small amount of cultivation in the 1720s, but really started to flourish after independence was won in 1822, and the new non-colonialist government decided to start clearing large expanses of rainforest to make room for more and more intensive plantations. By the early 1900s, Brazil was producing about 70% of the world's coffee exports, with their neighbors, Colombia and Guatemala in particular, making up most of the rest. Eurasian producers, formerly the only places where coffee was grown, remember, only made up about 5% of global exports by that time. The global market changed dramatically in the lead up to World War II, as Europe was a primary consumer of these beans, and about 40% of the market disappeared basically overnight because the continent was spending all of their resources on other things, mostly war-related things. An agreement between South and Central American coffee-producing countries and the United States helped shore up production during this period, and those agreements allowed other Latin American nations to develop their own production infrastructure as well, giving Brazil more hemispheric competition. And in the wake of World War II, when colonies were gaining their independence left and right, Ivory Coast and Ethiopia also became major players in this space. Some burgeoning Southeast Asian countries, most especially Vietnam, entered the global coffee market in the post-war years, and as of the 2020s, Brazil is still the top producer, followed by Vietnam, Indonesia, Colombia, and Ethiopia, though a few newer entrants like India are also gaining market share pretty quickly. As of 2023, the global coffee market has a value of around $224 billion, that figure varying quite a bit based on whose numbers you used and what you include in that figure. But it's in the hundreds of billions range, whether you're looking at just beans or including things like the ready-to-drink market as well. And the growth rate numbers are fairly consistent, even if what's measured and the total value placed on it differs depending on the stats aggregator you use. Some estimates suggest that the market will grow to around $324 billion, an increase of around $100 billion by 2030, which would give the coffee industry a compound annual growth rate that is larger than that of the total global caffeinated beverage market. And as of 2023, coffee accounted for something like 87% of the global caffeinated beverage market, so it's already the dominant player in that space, and is currently, at least, expected to become even more dominant by 2030. There is concern within this industry, however, that a collection of variables might disrupt that positive-seeming trajectory. which would not be great for the big corporations that sell a lot of these beans, but would also be really bad beyond shareholder value for the estimated 25 million people globally who produce the beans and thus rely on the industry to feed their families, and the 100 to 110 million more who process, distribute, and import coffee products, and who thus rely on a stable market for their paychecks. Of those producers, an estimated 12.5 million work on small farms of 50 acres or less, and 60% of the world's coffee is made by people working on these small holdings. About 44% of those people already live below the World Bank's poverty metric. So this is a fairly precarious economic situation already for many of the people at the base level of the production system. And any disruptions to what's going on at any level of the coffee industry could ripple across that system pretty quickly, disrupting a lot of markets and local economies alongside all the human suffering such disruptions could cause. This is why recent upsets to the climate that have messed with coffee crops are causing so much anxiety. Rising average temperatures, bizarre cold snaps, droughts, heavy and unseasonable rainfalls, in some cases all of these things one after another, combined with outbreaks of plant diseases like coffee rust, which are able to travel further and further afield because of those disruptions, have been putting a lot of pressure on this industry, including in Brazil and Vietnam, the world's two largest producers as of the mid-2020s. In the past year alone, because of these and other externalities, the price of standard model coffee beans has more than doubled, and the specialty stuff has seen prices grow even more than that. Higher prices can sometimes be positive for those who make the now more expensive product, if they're able to charge more but keep their expenses stable. In this case, though, the cost of doing business, those expenses, that's going up because coffee makers have to spend more to protect their crops from those diseases, and they lose a lot of money because of lost crops due to those climate issues. And they have to pay more because of disruptions to global shipping channels. That means profit margins have remained fairly consistent rather than going up. Higher cost to make, higher prices for consumers, so about the same amount of money being made as profit by those who work in the industry and those corporations that own the brands that put coffee goods on shelves. The issue, though, is that the cost of operation is still going up, and a lot of smallholders in particular, which again produce about 60% of all the coffee made worldwide, are having trouble staying solvent. Their costs of operation are still going up, and it is not a guarantee that consumers at the other end will be willing to continue spending more and more and more money on what's basically the same commodity product. There are a lot of caffeinated beverages, and there's a lot of other types of beverages as well that they could buy instead if coffee becomes too pricey. And at this point, in the United States, for instance, the retail price of ground roast coffee has surpassed an average of $7 per pound, up 15% in the past year. Everyone is expecting that price to keep climbing, and at some point these price increases will lose the industry customers, which in turn could create a cascading effect that kills off some of these smaller producers, which then raises prices even more. And that could create a spiral that is difficult to stop or even slow. Already, this increase in prices, even for the traditionally cheaper and less desirable robusta coffee bean, has led some producers to leave coffee behind and shift to more consistently profitable goods. Many plantations in Vietnam, for instance, have converted some of their facilities over to making durian fruit instead of robusta, and that's limited the supply of robusta, raising the prices of that bean, which in turn is causing some producers of robusta to ship to arabica, which is typically more expensive, and that has meant more coffee on the market is of this typically more expensive variety, adding to those existing price increases. The futures market on which coffee beans are traded are also being upended by these pricing issues, resulting in margin calls on increasingly unprofitable trades that, in short, have necessitated that more coffee traders put up money up front for their bets instead of just relying on short positions that have typically functioned something like insurance paid with credit based on future earnings. And this has put many of them out of business. And that, you guessed it, has also resulted in higher prices and more margin calls, which could put even more of them out of business in the coming years. There are ongoing efforts to reorganize how the farms at the base of this industry are set up, both in terms of how they produce their beans and in terms of who owns what and who profits how. This model typically costs more to run and results in less coffee production, in some cases 25% less. But it also results in more savings because trees last up to twice as long, and folks who work on the farms are much better compensated and less likely to suffer serious negative health impacts from their labor. And the resultant coffee is also of a much higher quality. So kind of a win-win-win situation for everyone, though again, it is less efficient. So up till now, this model has not really worked beyond some limited implementations, mostly in Central America. That could change, though, as these larger disruptions to the market could also make room for this type of segue toward that less efficient but overall better way of making coffee. And indeed, there has already been more interest in it because if the beans are going to cost more anyway, and the current way of doing things doesn't seem to work consistently anymore, and might even collapse over the next decade if something doesn't change, it may make sense, even to the soulless accounting books of major global conglomerates, to reset the industry so that it's more resilient, and so that the people holding the whole sprawling industry up with their labor are less likely to disappear someday, due to more favorable conditions offered by other markets, or because they're simply worked to death under the auspices of an uncaring, often fairly brutal economic and climatic reality. The book I'd like to recommend today is actually 3 books in a series. They are called On Writing and World Building, Volumes 1, 2, and 3 by Timothy Hickson. I was unaware of Hickson's work until I read these books. They were highly recommended from a few different people I talked to on the matter, and he produces some mostly YouTube content, I think, that's on similar subjects, world building, fiction writing, especially things related to fantasy and science fiction worlds, so I don't think exclusively. I'm writing a new science fiction trilogy at the moment, and this was an incredibly useful resource for that, getting me to think about things that I hadn't thought about before in terms of fleshing out the context in which the plot and the characters that I'm focusing on exist. And those world-building elements really are important because they inform so many little details that you can incorporate into that plot and into those characters and their lives. And that makes the entire undertaking, even the more speculative and otherwise unrealistic seeming bits, feel a lot more realistic, which is something that I really wanted to do with this trilogy. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of On Writing and World Building. You can start with Volume 1, but all 3 volumes are really valuable and well written. By Timothy Hickson. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.